At the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring back in 2011, a contagious optimism filled the streets in several Middle Eastern cities and trended on every news and social media platform. 6 years on, we have the advantage of hindsight, and so tonight we're reflecting on that earlier exuberance and where we are now. To do that, we are joined by Nergis Jennefe, Associate Professor, Political Science, Public Policy and Law at York University; Atif Kubursi, Professor Emeritus, Economics, McMaster University; Besma Momani, Professor, Political Science, University of Waterloo's Balsillie School of International Affairs, and Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation; and Lucan Way, Professor, Political Science, University of Toronto. And it's great to welcome everybody around our table here tonight for a discussion that I suspect, if we were going to have it 6 years ago, we would have hoped for a much happier ending and set of circumstances. Instead, we're going to go back and, in hindsight, figure out why this has gone so badly. So why don't we just go around the table with some theories? Besma, get us started here. Great optimism 6 years ago, almost a complete disaster 6 years later. Let's start with some theories. Why?
Well, basically, Arab governments thwarted the revolutions and have done everything in their power to ensure that the political development process is thwarted. And I think it's come at the hand of a lot of violence. Syria is a great example of that, as well as Egypt and other countries, Yemen. And clearly, it's a way to suppress the masses from taking over power. I mean, why would you want to give up power? And unfortunately, we had, in the case of Syria, a civil war that was brewed. And ultimately, that became a very important demonstration effect for other Arab governments to say, ha, 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 see, that's where your revolution will take you. So I'm the best alternative. Dictatorship is better. Stability is better. And frankly, they've effectively used that propaganda to basically prevent and roll back any progress made on democracy.
Atif Kubursi, why did the Arab Spring fail?
Well, it failed because so many factors, one of which is the governments who had every interest to suppress and maintain their hold on power. But one cannot ignore the geopolitical factors. All of a sudden, there's so many powers in the region and outside the regions. There's so an opportunity here to maneuver, to guide the change in their favor. And there is also something that is also missed, and this is the failure of the Arab development model. It was based on an authoritarian bargain where, okay, you give me your voice, I give you back services. What happened is that with the rent from oil coming down, with the economic difficulties, with the failure of this development model, they didn't have the resources. So all of a sudden, there is no public employment. Unemployment was rising very rapidly. Crony capitalism, in the sense that firms succeed in the area by being close to power or far away in the informal sector. Take the example of Egypt. The crony capitalism, to speak, those who are close to the authorities, represents 65% of the revenues, 90% of the profit, but only 11% of the employment. And then there is the oil factor. One dismisses oil factor. It did an incredible transformation in the area. It shifted power and influence to reactionary regimes, anti-democratic regimes. I mean, there isn't a single regime, perhaps with a minor exception in Kuwait, that you can consider to be democratic. But what oil does, it literally changes, reverses the relationship between the ruler and the ruled.
We'll follow up a little more on the oil angle as we go along. Nergis Jennefe, what would you add to the list of why the Arab Spring failed?
As an optimist with a healthy degree of pessimism, some would argue that it didn't fail yet, but it didn't produce the results that were expected. So what I'd like to say is this is actually the second wave of hopeful movement on the ground. The first one would be the independence. And Arab states and states in the region inherited certain structures for authoritarian tendencies and oppression that comes either from an imperial or a colonial background. So they kind of mastered the craft further. With the independence, they made very big promises. These are either rentier or what we call developmentalist states. So they're not like the state we have here, which is a regulative administrative state. They buy the citizenry. And if they cannot buy it, then they always have the military on the side waiting to step in. So there's a very long tradition of public conditioning of what happens to you if you question or if you protest and if you're not to be bought. I think the Arab Spring was the first time where that kind of dictum was challenged. But there is enough in the society, as Besma was saying, that is ready to pounce back and then bring the order back to the way it was.
I must say, that's a different take than I hear from most people. Most people say this thing failed, and their hopes were dashed, and they're very depressed about the prospects. I don't hear that from you. How come?
It's a bit like French Revolution. I mean, you know, it
too early to tell?
Yeah, I mean, it did fail initially, and then you did have other things happening. But 200 years later, we still make a reference to it as the first moment where people rose to power, well, whatever they rose to, and made a claim, as opposed to going along with the established regime. So,
I don't think, though, the people who were gathering in Tahrir Square were prepared to wait 200 years to see the Arab Spring that they were hopeful for. So where are you on that continuum?
Well, it's interesting. You know, I was on this show in February of 2011, and it was the only time in my life I've actually been right. And it was primarily because I was the most pessimistic on the panel. And it wasn't, you know, because I think Arab culture is inimical to democracy. It was because the basic conditions that political scientists argue promote democracy were simply not there. One of them is oil, and another one in Egypt. I looked at Egypt, even, you know, the inspiring revolution and crowds that have overthrown Mubarak, but you look at the basic authoritarian institutions, the military was still incredibly strong. So I just didn't see how you could create democracy when the military still dominated. And the other group that was strong was the Muslim Brotherhood, which is not especially democratic. So I just, for that simple reason, it's not rocket science, I could not see how democracy could emerge in Egypt.
Not rocket science, fair enough. And we should say you're fighting a little laryngitis tonight, so we thank you for coming on despite that. But everybody else, I remember that program, and everybody else, I remember Mohammed Fadl from the University of Toronto was on that program, Egyptian-born, so hopeful about what the possibilities could be. But you didn't see it.
Well, I've been there. You know, I was in Moscow in 1991. I was with that euphoria, and it's, you know, when suddenly all that solid melts into air, as Marx once said, everything seems possible. But then I realized, you know, basic structural conditions in Russia were not favorable to democracy, and that's in fact what happened. So to me, this was like a replay of my early life. You know, so I felt for those people. I felt, yeah, I was there. And it did not turn out very well.
I do want to pick up on one thing you said in the midst of that first answer, which was, and Besma, I'll go to you first on this. You say there's nothing necessarily inimical between the Middle East and more democracy. And obviously that is a point of great debate because there are many people who believe that there's just something about the Middle East, there's something about the culture, there's something about the people, there's something about the history that just is not consistent with more democracy. I see the look on your face, but you know that view is out there. So if you want to take it on, go ahead.
I'll take it on because the same was said about Catholics. So, you know, I mean, I think we need to be a little careful here. I mean, those sort of cultural reductionist arguments have been said many, many times ago. We had the same racist, and I think they're underlyingly racist arguments about the indigenous people in our country. So there is a long history of assuming somehow, you know, only white Anglo-Saxon people are not just worthy of democracy, but capable of democracy.
I didn't hear that. I don't hear anybody saying that.
No, but it's there is a subtle, I think, a subtle line of Orientalism in the argument, and you know, it's coded by a lot of, you know, very, I think sometimes interesting research markers. As a political scientist, I can say we've gotten it wrong many a times. We didn't predict the Arab Spring in the first place. Right. So, you know, we got that wrong. And yet, ironically, journalists, including Robert Worth, who was just on the show, if you looked at anything that journalists had written in the year before, they would have told you something is bubbling at the surface. And that's partly because of the indicators that we use. We were looking for certain markers of institutional building, which didn't exist. I agree with the premise that, you know, there's a lot of work to be done before the Arab Middle East may reach that point, but we don't know that tipping point. I mean, social science is not an exact science. We don't know. And not to mention, in this particular case, it was a domino effect, and domino effects are really hard to predict. But I just want to point out, I mean, the research that I had to read as a graduate student, which was still a little bit of frankly, acceptable research, was modernization theory. And modernization theory is now completely, you know, blasphemous in the sense that we could talk about, you know, well, Latin Americans aren't ready for democracy because they're Catholic and they don't have that, Protestant work ethic, and the Southern Europeans the same. And, you can go on and on. So I think we need to be really careful because it's been said before about other people, and we are just, seeing it today because there is a climate of suggesting that the Middle East will always be this, place of great violence. Again, and I've said this on your show at different times, when I was a graduate student, I wanted to study Latin America. Because Latin America in the 1980s and 1990s was the place. Revolution, terrorism, dictatorship, swings between populism and capitalism. So, we need to have a little bit of, be a little humble here and humility and understand history.
I just want to echo that. The same thing was said about Asian culture. You have democracy in Taiwan. Africa, you have many democracies in Africa. I think again and again, just because democracy has not ever taken root in a region does not mean it never will.
Chief, the very fact that the Arab Spring had taken place completely shattered this exceptionalism of the Arabs because of the tribes, because of religion, because of the structure of the Middle East. The very fact that just by a very minor incident, uncalculated slap on the face, changed things in Tunisia and migrated into Egypt and then into Libya, into Syria, into many other places. Even in the rest of the places, even Bahrain. The story here is that the Arabs are not inimical to democracy. It's the structure of forces that had come to play, trying to muzzle, trying to distort and these things that created this. Now, you say, well, what about the internal factors? There are lots of internal factors. No one can deny this. But the Arabs have shown that they're willing to put their lives online. They went on the streets in mass numbers, were willing to welcome bullets, trying to show that to them, dignity and freedom are inseparable. And the trouble is that it also came in to be dignity, freedom, and bread. In Egypt, the word bread means aish, means life. And much of what the Arabs really were looking for is to have these two together. They've been denied both for so long.
I guess it is a fact that if you looked at Latin America back when Ronald Reagan was president, you would have seen dictatorships and you would have seen revolutions, and you don't see that today. So is that what you hang your hat on in terms of optimism that democracy can come to the Middle East?
Well, about this problem of could Arabs do it, I'd invite us to look a little bit up north, Putin and post-Soviet Russian republics, and then also a little bit closer to our home here, down south, the whole Trump affair. And I think there is a marked rise of authoritarian populisms in the world, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere. They just follow different rhythms and different phases depending on the institutional legacies that you inherit from the state. My worry is that we're going to create a new Africa, the sunken continent, out of Middle East, especially.
What does that mean?
It means they can do nothing, they habitually kill each other, these societies are incapable of instituting peace and welfare of the public. And then that has been the stigma that was attached to Africa for a very long time, until South Africa kind of came out of the ashes, so to speak, with the new constitution, etc. So I think there's a reflex to do that, especially to entire regions and contexts when there is ongoing warfare. But if we do more of an in-depth analysis, perhaps we can identify social movements, political movements, state legacies, a bit of a hope in terms of these societies rebuilding themselves. And in that sense, you're right. I think Latin America is a good example. And when I was growing up, we were always given in the Middle East the example of Latin America and how they kind of pounced back from dictatorships and truth and reconciliation commissions and transitional justice. And in effect, that's coming back as well in terms of human rights activism in the Middle East, looking back to the examples in Latin America to see how you can come up with accountability regimes after mass violence in the region.
I should add that it's not all doom and gloom in the Middle East. Tunisia became democratic. Who would have thought? And why was that? That was because, in contrast to Egypt, the military stepped back. Civil society was able to come in. There's nothing inherent about Arab culture that makes democracy impossible.
But it's fragile, and there's terrorism there, and tourism is down, and it's right. I mean,
well, it's still the middle. They still are in the Middle East, and they suffer from external factors. But nonetheless, it is a democracy.
And it's absolutely the case now. Is the old order has crumbled. and there is no coming back. There is no question here that maybe things have gone a bit astray, but the germs, the nucleus is there. People have gained power, have gained voice, and I don't think they're going to let it go.
In Egypt, you see the people gaining power and voice in Egypt?
Absolutely, they're maybe, thumb down, maybe they're oppressed, but you talk to Egyptians. I just came back from a meeting of the Arab economists in Amman, and I'm talking to Egyptians there. I don't think any one of them is happy what's going on. There is a muted voice, but there is voice, and it's muted. And then somehow, somewhere, they had created the precedent that they were able to stand up and speak, and that precedent would not die. I am completely convinced that may take time. I mean, the French Revolution took, my God, so many years. They'll come back. The situation in the Middle East is irreversible.
Now, I appreciate that we live in an era now where, we want to have everything solved by the 6 o'clock news. However, having said that, what country 6 years later in the Middle East, as a result of those hopeful and optimistic Arab Springs, which country is better off today than it was 6 years ago?
I think Tunisia.
Tunisia
is better off.
Tunisia is for sure, but I think, let's keep in mind here, since 6 years, the entire world hasn't been better off. Back to Nergis's point, right? Not only are we in an era where the international financial crisis of 2008 hasn't yet, I think, we haven't seen the kind of recovery, economic recovery, bounce back since 2008 across the world. We're dealing with a stagnating economy globally, and that's affecting everywhere. Are Chinese people better off than they were 6 years ago? Well, I mean, they're not getting the 15% and 10% increase in GDP they were at that point. They're now maybe 4 to 6%. I mean, the same could be said all the way through. Donald Trump won on the very premise that life 6 years ago was, better than it is today. And I mean, I think we can look at the macroeconomic indicators and we can say, well, that's not quite accurate, but that's not important. It's the perception of people, right? And people across the world today are harking back to something of a golden age that things were better. And the same exists in the Middle East. I mean, there is definitely a sentiment within the Middle East that, oh my gosh, we've lost, a great deal of our liberties that we even had 6 years ago. But at the same time, if you talk to certain people, and I agree with Atif on this, that there is this sort of not going back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Not just because I think, frankly, people have changed, which they have, but also the tools, the social media, the space online, you can't put that back in there. If you're talking about trying to figure out what's going on in the Middle East, go look at the art community. The artistic community in the Middle East is thriving. Some of the most, I think, politically challenging works are happening today. Young people, for example, are taking on to online magazines and saying some pretty amazing things that 10 years ago would have never been said. The debates. I mean, what I love? When I go to the Middle East, I go to these debate clubs. They're actually literally debate clubs, and people are having on a panel some sophisticated debates that, frankly, 10 years ago were never there.
These academics?
No, these are young people in civil society movements. So, you know what? It's all about what kind of markers we're looking for. What's the unit of analysis that we're looking at? If I'm going to look at, just Transparency International's indexes, I'm going to be disappointed because absolutely the needle has not moved on things like political parties and some of the institutional building, but the culture of the people, the socio-political culture of the people in the Middle East, that has fundamentally changed. And the Arab Spring unleashed that desire for not just accountability from their government, but in saying enough is enough, that old way of thinking is not to our satisfaction.
There is one factor that is so absolutely important, and one we can, put some credit on, youth. You see, the Arab world is one of the regions of the world that has the highest proportion of youth in the total population. And these youth are now vocal. They have also mastered the social media. They're able to use Twitter, and they organized the whole Egyptian revolution on Twitter and Facebook. And the story here is this group is very dynamic, and this group has really bore the brunt of the economic collapse and the failed states. And this group you could gamble on. I mean, they're not going to remain quiet. They're very dynamic. They're reeling under very difficult economic circumstances. And it won't be long before these people have to reorganize again. If they were able to organize under the regime of Mubarak, I'm sure they can organize again under Sisi, under any regime. The trouble is that there are so many intervening variables. ISIS had come in that scared the heck of everybody, including myself. I mean, to some extent, I'm willing to swallow a bit things to get rid of these extremist groups. The collapse of the oil market is another factor. For an economy of the Arab world that is so dependent on oil, there is oil countries and there are non-oil countries, because we all depend on rent. If it's not rent from oil, it's rent from services we produce to the superpowers. Egypt lives on what big amounts that the US dishes, so is Jordan. And to some extent, this economy that has not produced jobs, that's not productive, that's basically rentier, rent-dependent, has been a major thwarting factor. But sooner or later, and I hope as soon as possible, we get to wean the Arab economies from oil, and this oil to disappear, there will have really the real chance to do things. Under oil, under rent, under the prevailing circumstances where resources had gone to the most archaic and most backward regions, the poor Arabs are really in trouble.
Lucan.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there are real reasons for pessimism. I mean, I think among them is in Washington. You have the leader of the free world who's openly autocratic. That is not good for democracy. I mean, one of the major reasons why you had democracy in the 1990s and after the Cold War was that the US was a model for the rest of the world in many ways. Not the perfect model, but nonetheless a model. That is no longer the case. And I think that is truly tragic. And therefore, I actually am quite pessimistic about the long-term prospects of democracy in the world because of what's going on in the United States.
Having said that, don't you also have a theory, though, that these things kind of come in waves and that democracy could just kind of
Well, I think what
wash
comes
up
in
on the
waves,
beach?
I'm not sure. I mean, what came in waves was protests. That's different from democracy. I mean, one of the mistakes I think that people made in early 2011 was that they confused protest and mass mobilization and overthrowing autocrats with democratization. Overthrowing autocrats is not the same thing as creating a democracy. Most of the, if you look at, political science literature, most of the time that autocrats have fallen, they've been replaced not by democracies, but by new forms of authoritarianism.
Well,
So
let's understand then. What is if it's not going to be Jeffersonian-style democracy where somebody comes riding in on a white horse, what's the alternative to democracy that you see there, potentially there?
Well, I mean, many forms of autocracy. That's an alternative. I think in a sense, the most important thing for creating democracy in the Middle East, as we see in Tunisia, is the basic destruction of these core authoritarian institutions, which give room for civil society to emerge. And that, that was what was wrong in Yemen. I mean, the authoritarian institutions, as your previous Robert Worth mentioned, just basically remain totally intact. And so I think that's the central problem.
What would you call this massive participation of people willing to come to the streets, voicing their discontent, wanting to get a voice, wanting to really change things, wanting the regime to be accountable, want to really fight corruption?
It's a democratic instinct, to be sure.
Well, yeah, but it's not democracy.
What would you call it?
Yeah, no, I mean, perhaps it's a democratic instinct, although that's not always clear exactly what these people want. But it's certainly not democracy. You had those crowds in 1979 in Iran that did not lead to democracy. I think it's important conceptually to distinguish the two, because part of the reason why we were so disappointed was that we thought that overthrowing autocrats was the same as creating democracy, and they're completely separate processes.
But these, Nergis, I don't think the crowds that we saw in Tahrir Square were clamoring for more theocracy in Egypt. I mean, that was not the case.
But I want to play devil's advocate here in the sense that we have to look at state traditions, and then there's a very disconcerting factor of state criminality, and then lack of accountability and normalization of violence when there is a display of this democratic instinct or public protests. I think that's where the cookie crumbles, so to speak, in the sense that you've got the crowds out there. They're beginning to articulate different kinds of claims in terms of the society's relationship with the state. But the state is just so free-handedly suppressing, oppressing, making people disappear, all variant forms of organized political violence has been happening, and then there's no accountability mechanism for those.
So just so we understand, this was as much about more freedom and more democracy as it was about no more corruption, no more kleptocracy, that kind of thing?
They actually say, especially in the case of Egypt and to a certain degree Yemen, that there was also desire about the class structural and unequal distribution of income and resources. So it wasn't just let's have more transparent institutions. It was more about there are certain classes in the society which would never be having access to a better life or fulfillment of their desires for a decent standard of living. So it was a composite, and it's a very strong instinct for crowds to hit the streets. But we've been seeing all manner of colorful revolutions and flower variations of revolutions up north, east, west. So I'd like to go back to what you were suggesting. That is not on its own indicative that a new wave of more transparent and accountable institutions will come forward, especially if you have very ingrained state traditions, which are shamelessly violent, and they can just go with impunity when they suppress these moments.
Shall we follow the money then? Besma, what about oil? We heard Atif say a second ago that as soon as these countries get off oil, or as soon as oil no longer is has these countries in their clutches the way it does today, there's a chance. What do you see?
With all due respect, it's not just about oil. I think the economic argument is the most important argument of this all. Absolutely. But there's no reason why these countries can't be like Norway. Oil in and of itself is not the problem. It's bad governance. It's corruption. It's that sense of entitlement. And back to the economic situation, there is an order of how these young people went out to the street in their arguments. They absolutely said bread, freedom, and dignity. And poll after poll, we know that one of the highest motivating factors for why people supported the Arab Spring was their economic situation, not the political, ironically. So it was not really, in many ways, we frankly frame them as democracy movements, but they were really about economics. And the biggest factor here, if you want to find the correlation, is corruption. Those 5 countries that had the Arab Spring had the worst case of corruption. And not to mention, you had this elite class that were living high-flying, unbelievable wealth, in high display for everybody to see. And yet you had people in the southern town of Daraa of Syria, you had people in the countryside of Tunisia, in the poor parts of Egypt, who were saying enough is enough. That discrepancy of wealth added to the added layer of a highly educated population. So this is no longer about a population of Arab people who no longer know what's happening behind the country club. They know exactly what's happening.
But your book does not have the title Spring in it. It had the title Dawn in it, right? It had the word dawn.
Because sociocultural change is there, and so it's a new beginning. That is the essence of it. We did not see a political revolution in the Arab world, but we saw a sociocultural one. The people are fundamentally different today, and it's young people, absolutely. When 80% of the population is under the age of 30, and I teach young people, it's really hard to take a 20-year-old seriously, which is the average age right now, but in 10, 15 years, the geriatrics that are in charge of these countries have to die off, thank God to nature, and these people will be 30s and 40s, and they will be taken seriously. They're far more educated than ever. They're far more cosmopolitan than ever. They want democracy overwhelmingly. We know 80% of the population or more want democracy, and I think they're quite capable. We need to remove that cultural reductionist
And these guys
argument.
want in. 1 and 2. Go ahead.
Oil is very important. You can't underestimate what the importance of oil. And it's not just oil as a physical product, and not oil as the huge amount of surplus. It still costs less than $2.50 to lift a barrel of oil. Even at $50, there is a huge rent. And that rent is not all digested into the region. We got $4 trillion coming from oil into the region. We don't have much to show for it except these large, huge, long towers. We don't have the economic vitality and vibrancy and capacity to create jobs.
So why no Arab Spring in Saudi Arabia then?
Well, I'm going to tell you, the oil is the most important, but one more important factor that we have missed so far is this oil is coveted by powers that have always seen the oil as their leverage, their capacity to manipulate the rest of the world. Oil, OPEC, in my view, I worked for them. I was very euphoric about it. I discovered in the end that OPEC was completely used by the US to act as a vacuum cleaner of all the euro dollars the Europeans and Japanese got when the US was involved and implicated in Vietnam. In many respects, when you talk about oil in Norway, it's no comparison to the Arab world. We have 75% of the proven reserves. They have nothing really compared to what we have. And much of this oil is in the hand of corrupt governments that you could manipulate. Many people, we have now an Arab summit. At one time, Gaddafi, for whatever reason and how the poor man was out of order, many things, he said, in most of the Arab summits, we typically get a fax of what the declaration should be. To a great extent, the foreign hands, the foreign encroachment on the region, the complete co-option of all the regimes, and taking away from the people their voice. It's not just the government. These governments would have never really been in such a strong position had it not been for the West, particularly the United States, standing behind these governments, supporting these governments. Right now, I mean, the Trump administration, who presumably did, September 11, no, it's Yemen cannot come to the U.S. Moroccan can't come. All the other regimes, but those who really have the money and have the power, who have been the very basis of all this extremism, are completely exonerated and can travel.
Yeah, I just want to push back a little bit on the generation argument, because I feel like, again, I've sort of been here before. In the communist region, everybody thought, well, we have this new generation that wasn't reared under communism, they're going to be more democratic. It just hasn't turned out that way. Sadly, I mean, they were also socialized by the system they're in. The Putin generation is mostly, is cynical, is just more cynical, but not necessarily more democratic than the older generation.
And therefore, you don't have the reason for optimism.
I don't have the same reason for optimism. I'm not saying that democracy is necessarily doomed, but I wouldn't put too much of a hope in the next generation.
Can I continue on that line? Please. In the sense that when we look at United States and any other presidential systems, we don't necessarily immediately label them as undemocratic, but there's a substantive reason for that, because they have checks and balances, and then they have public institutions which would somehow exercise power over the presidential office. So part of the problem might be, for the future of Middle East, is there's a trend towards these single-headed presidential models of governance. And for those to have a democratic promise in them, you then have to have these inner layers of checks and balances in place in terms of public administrative law, and the society somehow confronting the state for unlimited and disproportionate use of power, right? So it's not so much they have presidential, in terms of form, they have presidential representation systems. It's more about the entire workings of the state. And then that's where the promise will lie, right? So in a way, oddly, I don't think people come out and say it, but Putin's regime constitutes a good example for many of the regimes in the Middle East, because it's just top-down, very little accountability, populist, and it carries the day.
I literally got a minute to go here. Besma, I want to give it to you, and I want you to answer this question. Nobody loses money betting against the Middle East. Tell people who are watching this right now, who just assume that the news is always going to be bad and will only ever get worse, why they ought to care about what's going on in a part of the world that they probably have washed their hands of.
Well, that's a hard argument to make. I would just say people who visit the region, go there frequently, have a very different impression. And that's partly because I think there isn't a person that I've met, and having taken students there, having taken others to the region, when they go there, they realize, oh, wow, they're just like us. And I think it's absolutely ridiculous that that statement comes out, but it's the reality. They are just like us, trying to lead decent lives. And, there's fair game here in criticizing their governments, and we need to do that. We need to hold all governments to account. And there is no perfect democracy out there, but to somehow reduce this to somehow there's a cultural phenomena in the region preventing democracy is far too simplistic, and frankly, tends to dehumanize the region and has come from people who don't visit the region. I mean, it's incredible to me that when we talk to those who continue to have that argument, and Trump is the first of that kind, have zero experience in the region. It is absolutely vital to visit and see that this is a place of hope, They're not pessimistic. They see the future as far more optimistic than ever. They absolutely want democracy. They're willing to fight for it. They're pursuing university degrees faster than any other region in the world.
You know what I want?
Yeah.
More time, but I haven't got it. So that's it. Besma Momani
And come
from
with
CG.
me to the region.
Nergis, okay, I'll take you up on that someday. Nergis Jenifet, York University on that side of the table. Atif Kaborsi, McMaster University, Lucan Way, University of Toronto on the other side of the table. Good of all of you to come into TVO tonight and help us out with this. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.